right, good morning, and welcome to this morning's panel on the history of happiness. I'm going to guess that some of you wandered in here thinking, how could happiness have a history? What is a history of happiness? It seems like it might be a feeling, a sentiment, perhaps a state of mind or a state of being, but how could it have a history? The two papers you're going to hear this morning will suggest, I think, that the way we think about ourselves, our souls, what we might naturally long for, our relation to others, our relation to God, have decisively shaped the way that we perceive happiness and consequently how we pursue it. So you'll hear two papers this morning. The first to present will be Dr. Mary Hirschfeld. Dr. Hirschfeld is an associate professor of economics and theology in the Department of Humanities at Villanova University. She holds a PhD in economics from Harvard and a PhD in moral theology from Notre Dame. Her CV is one of the few that has a section entitled Dissertations, plural. I don't think I've seen it before. She has published widely in acclaimed journals and has a recent book out at Harvard University Press entitled Aquinas and the Market, Toward a Humane Economy. Today, she'll be giving us her thoughts on the history of happiness. And then next, we'll have a double header or a paper presented in two parts by my husband, Dr. Ben Story, and myself. We both teach political philosophy at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, and we co-direct a program for students that are interested in great books education. It's called the Tocqueville Program, one of the Tocqueville programs around this country. We would love to meet some of your students and welcome them into our program. So if you're interested in Furman University, perhaps hadn't heard about it before, feel free to talk to us after our discussion. We both received our PhDs from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. My husband is an associate professor and has written many articles on French thought. I am an assistant professor. I've written a few articles on German thought. Together, we just finished a manuscript entitled Why We Are Restless: 4 French Thinkers on Our Endless Quest for Contentment. And it's from that book that we'll be presenting our paper today. We also have children in a classical Christian school in Greenville, South Carolina. It's called Veritas Preparatory Academy, and I serve on the board of that school. So I'm really interested in questions of K through 12 education as well. Okay.
So I need to start off with an apology. I had notes for this talk. As recently as 10 minutes ago, I was sitting in a chair downstairs looking at them, but they somehow did not make it up here with me, and I can't go back and look for them. So I'm going to wing it. The other caveat is I am not myself a teacher of history or a student of history. As you heard, my PhDs are in different subjects altogether. But when Robert asked me to speak at this, I said, well, I think I could fit on your program because the way we think about happiness is strongly determined by our historical development. And I think that's important for people to be aware of. So what do I have in mind? If you start with economics, which is where I start with, economics thinks of itself as an ahistorical discipline. People are always more or less acting the same according to the same sets of incentives. And economics carries with it a strong idea about the nature of human happiness that, in fact, from my point of view, shoots through our entire culture. Okay, that's the first starting point. And the idea of happiness is it's essentially subjective. It's what you want. So the happiness is the satisfaction of your desires, preferably as many desires as you can. And the only thing that keeps you from getting as far up the ladder of happiness as you can possibly go is limitations that you confront in terms of scarcity, both of time and of money. So if only I had more time, I could read more books, and I think reading books makes me happy. So, or if only I had more money, I could go on more vacations and see more parts of the world, and that would make me happy. So the idea of happiness is essentially one of extension, okay? And behind that comes the idea that, well, if you want, everybody has different ideas about what more they want. Maybe more friends, maybe more time to read more books, maybe bigger houses, maybe more vacations, maybe more nicer dinners out. They can be material, they can be non-material, but we always think of it in terms of extension. Okay, and that sounds like it's nice and pluralistic. We all pursue our own different ideas of happiness. It's what you want or what you want or what you want. But because what's constraining us from getting higher up our ladder of happiness is limitations of time and money, that means that what we really actively pursue is more time and more money. Okay, and so that's why economic progress, at least in the discipline of economics, but I think it saturates our culture. Economic progress is always desirable because it frees up those constraints and lets you get happier. Okay. As I progressed in my thinking and when I started off as an economist, that seemed right. But then as I moved into my life, it seemed not so right. In particular, when I got my first job and my income doubled, I found that my happiness didn't double. In fact, it didn't really go up at all, because happiness seems to be about something other than just kind of getting the next desire or the next desire. So God in his mercy threw me off my horse. I converted unexpectedly to becoming a Catholic. I decided to go, and it seemed to me the path to God had more to say about happiness than the path to the ladder of economic growth. So I went out to study theology at Notre Dame. And there, through reading Thomas Aquinas, who takes you back to Aristotle, you get to an idea that I think should be familiar to people involved in classical education, which is the more ancient understanding of happiness as a perfection of being. So what do I mean? I'm thinking about an Aristotle, for example. So happiness for Aristotle is not a matter of extension or getting more of the things that you can have. True happiness is becoming a better version of yourself. John Paul II talks about the distinction between thinking of progress as a progress in what you can have versus progress in cultivation or depth of being. So a fulfilling life is one where you try to become a good version of yourself. You cultivate the classic virtues: fortitude, temperance, justice, prudence. If you're Christian, hope, faith, and charity. You try to develop your relationships with people. You try to order your life to the pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful. So it's got a more transcendent feel. And the project of finding happiness is sinking into that goodness as deeply as possible, but it's not a matter of extension. My book deals a lot with how damaging our modern idea of happiness is. If you think about it as a matter of extension, there's never, ever enough. It leads to widespread anxiety. The idea that more is always desirable puts us into conflict with each other. It's what generates a lot of the economic injustice that we see, and it puts a huge pressure on the environment because we always just want to push out that boundary more and more. Pope Francis in Laudato Si does an excellent job of diagnosing our underlying desire for more as being what's damaging to our societies and to the world around us. So I have a normative bent by taking up the topic of happiness. I think the more ancient idea of happiness is more fulfilling, it's more balanced, and I want my students to see that this way of happiness is a better one. Okay, and that entails telling a little bit of story about the shift. How did we go from a world that understood happiness as being this fulfillment to one that sees it as this matter of extension? So one of the key ideas that Aristotle has is because you're trying to pursue these higher goods, material wealth and time and things like that are valuable because they help you to do those things. But this is going to be the key point, and then I'm going to try to trace out how it goes wrong. If I am an Aristotelian or a Thomist, and I have this idea that I'm going to try to be an excellent version of myself, living as a single professor, I'm going to figure out what kind of wealth I need to sustain that life. And because wealth is an instrumental good in support of these higher goods, my desire for the instrumental good is always measured by the ultimate aim that I have. The classic example of an instrumental good is medicine. Okay. If I have a headache, the bottle says 2 aspirin is what I need to fix my headache, then I want 2 aspirin. And I would never ever think that 10 aspirin would make me better off. Do you guys? And the idea is if we were actually in right relationship with wealth in the Aristotelian or Thomistic sense, we would view wealth the exact same way. I'm a professor with this kind of a life. In order to carry out my functions, I need $55,000 a year, period. And if I ever get a raise above that, that is abundance that I would want to share with I have no need of it. Do you see how? Okay. Now, most of my students like to think, oh, I got that. I don't want to be a billionaire. Right? I don't want to pursue wealth in an open-ended way. I have very good reasons why I want more money. And people always come and talk to me. It's like, well, I want to give my kids a good education. I want this, I want that. They have real ends for their instrumental good. So I like to tell a parable, because the parable is meant to show that each and every one of us really, truly has this disordered idea about wanting more of that instrumental good. Okay, so parable time. You can imagine a family that I'm going to call the Aardvarks. And the Aardvarks have a higher good that they want to pursue, which is music. They feel like they have a calling to pursue the good of music. Okay, and they make a living as potters. They make pots and they sell them in order to make a living. So they have a family council and they say, we love music. What should we do? And they say, well, there's this beautiful grand piano that would just, wow, that would really make our music playing really good. That's what we want in order to become a musical family. And so they go and work hard and they save their money. They sell their pots. They save their money. And after 3 long years, they finally buy the grand piano. They bring it in. It's beautiful. The kids take lessons. They play on the piano. They become excellent musicians. They order their lives around, and they still make pots to make a living, but they dial back on the pot making. They spend their extra time playing their piano. They have neighbors over for musical soirees. It's a lovely life. That's an Aristotelian picture of how wealth is ordered to a good life. Everybody good with that? Okay, 3 villages over, their cousins are also a musically inclined family. They're the warthogs. You can tell what I think of them by calling them warthogs. The warthogs are a musical family. They have their family council. They say, hey, grand piano would be great. And they're also potters. Let's make some pots, sell some pots, save some money, buy a grand piano. It's all the same. 3 years later, grand piano shows up. They're ecstatic. Lovely grand piano. Play around with it a little bit and they say, you know what? Schubert has those really beautiful trios with a cello and a violin and a piano. Let's go back to work and earn some more money and get a cello and a violin. So they spend another couple years at their pots, and then they got the cello, and then they got the beautiful trio, and it's lovely. And they go, wow, but there's this other music, jazz. Let's do some jazz. We need to get one of those big bass things and a clarinet and a saxophone and a horn, and so then they go back to work with their, and then they get all that. Now their house is really crowded. And they need more space for all their instruments because they're tripping over them. So they go back to work and they get a bigger house. And you see where I'm going with this. They thought their lives were about music, but it was always about the money. And the difference is they had an open-ended idea of extension rather than sinking into the good that was the music itself. Okay. Almost all of us have that problem. And you can tell that the simple diagnostic is this. You've never met an American that didn't want a 10% raise. And the reason they want the 10% raise is they have some next saxophone that they want to get. Okay. All right. So the idea is a lot would be better in our own souls, in our society, if we could go back to understanding the Aristotelian idea, the aardvark way, where you get your piano and then you cultivate your actual life rather than letting it be all about making pots. There's just 3 historical landmarks that I want to point out to you that I use with my students to show them how we got from point A to point B. First point I want to make is not one of those 3 points. It's that Aristotle and Plato and all the ancients who understood this, they recognized the temptation to think of happiness as extension. They even gave it a name, a vice called pleonexia. Okay. If you read the Politics, before Aristotle starts describing a good political order, he says, you know what, there's this thing called pleonexia. It comes in through markets and economic activity. Plato in the Republic, before Socrates starts launching on his big discussion of the just city, says we could have had a just city if only people sitting around didn't get this pleonexia thing going. Like he's got the perfect city going and then they just want to have like better figs and a comfortabler couch. And then it just keeps going. And the next thing you know, you've got a really complicated problem getting justice. So the ancients knew that we are inclined to pleonexia. That's not news. That's not the shift. They always thought it was there. They just named it as a vice. They understood it was an obstacle to justice, to genuine human flourishing. So the first big shift that happened was Machiavelli. Machiavelli's idea was, gosh, Aristotle and Plato, you've got all these nice political theories, but it's about people acting the way people do not act. Let's get real, let's get pragmatic, let's get realistic. It's the realistic turn. People as they actually are pleonexic. And so a good leader will take that into account, and by the way, is himself pleonexic, and we'll just figure things out from there. Okay, let's get real. Thomas Hobbes comes in a couple hundred years later, and he says, it's not even a matter of getting real. Maybe it's just the way things, not even just the way things are. Maybe it's the way things should be. And I wish I had my quote, which I have, but he basically says, this idea of happiness as perfection is a mirage. Happiness is getting one thing, one desire satisfied, and getting up the next day and satisfying another desire in a process that ceaseth not until death, right? One thing after another. So he deproblematizes pleonexia. Basically says, that's happiness just is. Go get as much as you can until you die. Okay. So out in the wake of Machiavelli and Hobbes, the problem for thinking about human society is no longer, can we try to inculcate virtue, try to build just societies, or so on. The problem becomes more, how can you draw good social order out of a bunch of pleonexic people? And so you get the idea that markets, for example, can take my desire to get more, but in order for me to maximize my income or maximize my profits, probably the market through competition will force me to offer you pretty good products so that I can get your business. I will work hard to make you things so that you will give me money so I can get more. And in the process, there will be a general creation of wealth. This would be the main insight you get from an Adam Smith. And then the history of economics and political science ever since has been, okay, that works mostly, but not always, and how do we balance this out? And how can we structure our institutions so as to get relatively decent outcomes out of a bunch of pleonexic people? And they wouldn't use the term pleonexic, but people as they are who just want more as a natural state. The last thing I want to point out is Adam Smith, of all people, is a good resource that I use with my students to say, hey, we do not necessarily need to go down this road. Adam Smith does indeed say that it's probably best if you want to provision people with the materials that they need in life. Markets are a good way to do it. If I'm a baker, I offer you some bread, you pay me money, and then I use the money to you, the butcher, to buy your meat. And that's a useful way to order our economic lives. It's perfectly reasonable to think that I make my living in a way that's designed for me to sustain myself, to make money, but in a way that provides you with stuff. He's the guy who does that. But in his theory of moral sentiments, which is sadly neglected work, he has a much richer account of human nature than a modern economist would have. And he calls into question this pleonexia. He clearly has an idea that a truly good life, a truly happy life, would be one that was more around cultivating virtue. His account of the virtue is not quite Aristotelian, but it would be about trying to find what's fitting or appropriate or comely, lovely ways of interacting with people. And then, I think it's book 2. He's developed his theory of moral sentiments about how we actually do care about other people, we care about our reputations, and our reputations play out in terms of treating others in a way that's lovely. Okay, and he says, at the end of the day, it's really important for us to be recognized for the good that we do. That's an important component of human nature. And if you think about it, that's right. That we want to. The phrase that Russ Roberts always uses, we want to be lovely and lovable. So we want to be admired or loved, but for actually being lovable. That's the essence of happiness for him. And it's compatible, I think, with an Aristotelian take. And Smith says, the problem is there's only a few people who want to be lovable, who want to be loved for being lovable, who want that admiration because they've actually developed these beautiful characters. They really are good and gracious people. He says most people want to be loved, full stop, and most people have this admiration, social attraction for people who are successful, who have a lot of money, a lot of status, a lot of power. And then he says, and this is the secret to all the toil and bustle, because he's in the incipient phases of capitalism. People are starting to scramble around looking for the next buck. And he says, for what purpose is all this toil and bustle? It's not because people want to have bigger houses or finer clothes. He says, at the end of the day, there's not a big difference in terms of day-to-day life between the great and the poor. They all have enough to eat. They have a place to sleep. They have enough to go out and have a good time. He says, the reason why we think the big house is more desirable than the small house is because if I have the big house, you guys all look at me and you think I'm awesome. It's for the social status of it. And I think this is a real key and insight to think about. A lot of our restless striving for more comes out of this unceasing desire for more attention from others that comes through material gain. to me, that's a useful insight. First, because Smith, the father of economics, does not think material wealth is of itself a path towards happiness, number one. Number two, he thinks, wish I had my notes. So he doesn't think wealth is a path to happiness. And he thinks it can be a distraction. He offers actually a moral defense of capitalism on this basis that I think is worthwhile for people to know, because I think it helps us think about our modern situation a little bit better. He's writing out of a period where the path towards status and wealth was not through building up a business and making a lot of money that way. It was rather by going to court and being a toady and sucking up to the guy so you could get a place in court. If anybody's seen the Man for All Seasons, this would be exactly Richie Rich. Okay, he's writing about a Richie Rich world. And he says in that world, the path towards status is not compatible with anything that's lovely. It's not compatible with anything admirable in the human character. It's really quite disgraceful. And he's really even-tempered writer, but he gets a little hot on this. He has some choice things to say about Louis XVI and people like that. From his point of view, the beauty of capitalism, emergent capitalism, he was not using that term, but the beauty of the emerging commercial society in Scotland is that the path towards wealth for the bourgeois, the middle class, would be to start that business. So I start my dry cleaner store. And he says, well, what do you need what kind of person do you have to be to carry on this good business, to earn that wealth? Well, I have to be honest. I have to work hard. I have to be creative. I have to be friendly with my customers. It would be helpful if I knew them while I'm provisioning them with beautiful mustard stain-free clothes, things like that. It says the path towards wealth is also the path towards developing a fairly good character. There's something to that idea, but you should also notice how far we are from it in our world. And I think it gives us a way to think about the way corporations and these large-scale economic activities end up suppressing the good, beneficial aspects of markets and capitalism in favor of the idea that I just want to make a buck, and however I can get it, I don't care how I do it. And I think I've gone too long. I have many examples of how this plays out in the world. But the idea here is just to give resources to my students to help them see that there's better ways of thinking about happiness in a way that's that takes into account where we are. We're at the end of Machiavelli, Hobbes, and all the rest. But to try to point them back to a more rich and fulfilling way of approaching life. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I'll have to do the same thing that Mary did at the start of her talk and confess that I found the conference's theme, the historian's craft, a little intimidating. As my wife mentioned, the two of us were trained in an interdisciplinary graduate program, and we now teach in a politics department. Our courses center on the great books, and many academic historians would deny that what we do is history. So I wondered, did Robert Jackson invite us by mistake? Has he gotten something wrong about my CV? But last night I was talking at after dinner with a very distinguished historian at the University of Colorado named Patty Limerick, who's here, and she described history as an effort on the part of the living to lend life force to the dead, to let the dead speak again through us. And I thought to myself, whew, this lady is as legit as they come, and that's exactly what we do. So it is history. But why do we do it? Why should we bend our efforts to making the dead speak? What do the dead have to say that might be relevant to life as we live it right now? To answer this question, my wife and I are going to talk about some of the things we've observed about college students in our work as teachers, and how we've come to understand what we've observed in students with the help of some of the voices of the dead that we strive to resuscitate in our classrooms. And bringing these two things together, live students and dead authors, we hope to offer an example of how education that takes the voices of the dead seriously can help us understand our students and ourselves better, and perhaps live better as a result. So many of the students that we get to teach at Furman University are splendid. They're probably not unlike the future selves of some of the students that you all get to teach. But we see a certain troubling pattern in the souls of these young people, a disquiet that manifests itself in a perplexity that often strikes them as they approach their college graduation. I think I can best describe this perplexity by sketching a picture of one such student. So, this imaginary student, is a young woman in the fall of her senior year of college. She's a star. She's accumulated a splendid academic record in 2 majors. She's done internships and she's studied abroad. She's founded a student group and been an officer in several others. So one day, fall of her senior year, she asked to meet with the 2 of us in the campus coffee shop to talk about her future. Given her accomplishments and her prospects, we're figuring this is going to be easy. So, law school or a PhD. For years, she's had her eyes on these goals, and she's now well positioned for either one. But then the options that she puts on the table in this conversation start to diverge. Maybe teaching. That seems plausible. Maybe farming. That doesn't seem so plausible. Perhaps a year abroad. Perhaps a return home. Perhaps more school. Perhaps no more school, ever. As she detects the discordance of the possibilities she's contemplating, this young woman is unnerved. She's made the most of her American birthright to pursue happiness wherever it leads, but her very success has left her at a loss. Years of steady progress have culminated in a strange and restless paralysis. This restlessness is not peculiar to any one student. We've had eerily similar conversations with many such students, high flyers who have made good use of the many advantages they have enjoyed, whose records promise them impressive lives, and who nonetheless do not know which way to turn when they face graduation. So what is going on? Fortunately, for those who wish to understand this strange combination of good fortune and restless unease, the phenomena has a long history. Almost 180 years ago, the great French thinker Alexis De Tocqueville described Americans as restless in the midst of their well-being. Although Americans, as he saw them, were the most free and enlightened men placed in the happiest condition in the world, he says that a kind of cloud habitually covered their features, and they seemed grave and almost sad, even in their pleasures. As he writes, a man in the United States carefully builds a house in which to spend his old age, and he sells it when the roof is being put on. He plants a garden, and he rents it as he's about to taste its fruit. He embraces a profession, and he leaves it. And if he has a little leisure at the end of the year, he takes his restless curiosity here and there across the expanse of this vast country. The Americans Tocqueville saw had an incapacity for sitting still that revealed an abiding discontent. So, we think we can begin to understand the distinctive restlessness that we observe in our students and that Tocqueville observed long ago in the light of what we will argue is our distinctive way of pursuing happiness. That way of pursuing happiness developed centuries before Tocqueville, precisely as a strategy for palliating the natural restlessness of the human heart. We then want to argue that this modern way of understanding happiness, which we will call imminent contentment, exacerbates the very restlessness that it is intended to alleviate. We want to suggest that the particular form of agitation that attends this particular way of pursuing happiness explains much about the present state of both our personal lives and our politics. So we're going to make this argument by drawing on a conversation among 3 French thinkers. First, the great essayist Michel de Montaigne, who originated the way of pursuing happiness we aim to understand and assess. Second, the astonishing polymath Blaise Pascal, who offered the first and still most powerful critique of this way of pursuing happiness. And finally, Tocqueville himself, who shows us what this mode of pursuing happiness does to our politics when it becomes the default way of life for an enormous modern nation. We'll close by suggesting something of how all of us could help our students live better with their restlessness by reconsidering some of the basic assumptions behind this modern way of pursuing happiness. And so I'll do the first couple parts of this, Montaigne and Pascal, and then my wife will take over and talk about Tocqueville. So, part one, Michel de Montaigne and the art of imminent contentment. So, the story we're going to tell of the modern pursuit of happiness begins in an era of profound unhappiness, the wars of religion of 16th century France. Michel de Montaigne lived through 8 such wars, which convulsed France, turning neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother from 1562, when Montaigne was about 30, until the Edict of Nantes in 1598, 6 years after his death. So Montaigne began writing his essays in the year 1572, and that's the year that the wars of religion reached their lowest point with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre on August 24th. Montaigne describes that book in which he inaugurates the use of the term essay to describe a literary form. The word essay in French is an old word with an interesting history, but he's the first person to use it to refer to a piece of writing. He describes that book as a self-portrait, his essays. And that portrait offers a charming depiction of a self successfully engaged in the pursuit of imminent contentment against the backdrop of France's bloody wars of theology and fanaticism. And it is that contrast that gives the essays their pathos, right? You know, it's this nasty civil war going on in the background and this kind of joyful life in the foreground. So Montaigne writes the essays in obedience to the Delphic injunction to know thyself. I study myself more than any other subject, he writes. That is my physics, that is my metaphysics. Highly personal though his book is, however, it's not without political import. It is by sounding the depths of his own apparently peaceable soul that Montaigne discovers the deepest causes of the troubles of his country. So we are never at home, Montaigne writes. We are always beyond. Fear, desire, and hope launch us toward the future and rob us of the sentiment of what is, to amuse us with what will be, even when we will be no longer. So such is Montaigne's depiction of human restlessness, which he knows firsthand. So he's describing the way in which, as he puts it in the title of that chapter, our souls reach out beyond us. So as Montaigne tells the story, when he first retired from his political career to his chateau to undertake a life of solitary contemplation, nice work if you can get it, his own mind bolted like a runaway horse, giving birth to all manner of chimeras, fantastic monsters, as he says. Montaigne is himself a restless soul. So to alleviate this restlessness, Montaigne seeks to teach us and himself the art of being at home. The first lesson of that art is, as he puts it, learning to die. For Montaigne thinks that our restlessness is driven largely by our obsession with our own mortality. For his own part, Montaigne wants to die without thinking about it, and tells us that death will find him planting his cabbages, nonchalant about death, and still more about his unfinished garden. So Montaigne's instruction in the art of dying well is a not particularly veiled critique of the Christian concern with immortality. But it is much more than that. Montaigne sees much of human ambition, the aspirations that drive philosophy, theology, and politics, and even virtue itself, as a misanthropic and cruel rebellion against the human condition. And that rebellion fuels, among other things, the political and religious traumas of his time. So this is how he sees our restlessness as driving the political chaos that surrounds him. Montaigne's art of living is therefore an art of circumscription. He says, the course of our desires must be circumscribed and restrained to the nearest and most contiguous good things. Moreover, their course should not be directed in a straight line that ends up elsewhere, but in a circle, of which the 2 points grasp one another and meet in ourselves by a brief contour. So he's got this image of circumscription as his image of happiness. Ambitious lives take the form of that straight line that ends up elsewhere. Montaigne seeks to bend those energies back around so as to return to himself. So elsewhere, Montaigne specifies what this art of circumscription looks like in concrete terms. In household management, in study, and in every other exercise, he writes, we must go up to the last limits of pleasure, but guard ourselves from engaging still further, where pleasure begins to be mingled with pain. Montaigne's art of living is thus frankly hedonistic, but without the austerity that ancient thinkers like Epicurus thought true hedonism implied. So Epicurus was a hedonist, but he thought that this involved a lot of self-restraint. So the motto of the Montaignian art of imminent contentment is thus moderation through variation. So he describes a life that seeks to achieve the ancient maxim of temperance, nothing too much, but it adds to it a gentle modern corollary, nothing too little. So although Montaigne draws extensively on the classical and Christian traditions to expand his vision of the good life, his departure from those traditions are substantial. Whether we consider the way of life of a philosopher such as Socrates, or a citizen such as Cato, or a saint such as Augustine, all of them are living lives guided by some one thing needful, some pearl of great price, some virtue or activity without which life is not worth living. Whether that one decisive thing is understood as philosophy or citizenship or holiness. So all these pre-modern examples have some one goal, even if they differ about the goal. Where Socrates contrasted the good life with mere life, Montaigne argues that mere life is the good life. We are great fools, he writes, to criticize a man for passing his life in idleness, or to look down on ourselves for having done nothing today. What? He asks. Have you not lived? That is not only your fundamental occupation, but your most illustrious one. This elevation of mere life, which might look slavish to a Roman or hellish to a Christian, to the status of the good life, is Montaigne's great contribution to what we call modernity. So in the wake of Calvin and Machiavelli, Montaigne's art of seeking our contentment imminently speaks to the desires, as Pierre Manon has put it, of the millions of human beings who care neither for the salvation of their cities nor for the salvation of their souls. So this new understanding of the good life brings a new understanding of virtue in its wake. First among these new virtues is nonchalance, the cultivated carelessness that allows somebody like Montaigne not to take anything too seriously. The essays themselves, which read like an undulating stream of consciousness without premeditated form, exemplify this rejection of the arts of orderliness. The intellectual side of this virtue is skepticism, the doubt which Montaigne applies to everything, thereby rebuffing the attempts of any and every good to take over his life. By living in this way, Montaigne is able to exemplify the virtue of frankness in his speech. He's a man without pretensions. He has nothing to hide, and so he can dispense with the caution and politesse that usually govern our speech and be straight with us. So Montaigne's his essays, was enormously successful. It was perhaps the most widely read book in Europe during the whole 17th century. Many of the great thinkers of that and future centuries would warm themselves at Montaigne's cheering fire. Shakespeare and Francis Bacon, Diderot and Voltaire, Emerson and Nietzsche, Virginia Woolf, and Stefan Zweig. In the generations immediately following Montaigne's death, the essays found an enormous audience among the rising class of those who were called bourgeois gentilshommes, a newly ascendant social group looking for a moral model to replace the chivalric ideal of the old nobility they intended to supplant. Many of them found that model in Montaigne, who became the standard bearer for the way of life of the so-called honnêtes hommes. That's what they started to call themselves, the honest men, the honnêtes hommes. But it was from that social class that arose in the 17th century the man who was at once perhaps Montaigne's greatest reader and Montaigne's greatest critic, Blaise Pascal, who would argue that Montaignean self-knowledge is self-alienation, and that Montaignean happiness is human misery. So, turn to Pascal next. The point with respect to Montaigne, you seek your happiness imminently, without concern with transcendence. You do so by pursuing a variety of goods, none of them too seriously. Okay. So, part 2, Blaise Pascal in the Inhumanity of Imminence. A frightening genius. That is what Pascal was called by the father of French Romanticism, François-René de Chateaubriand. A brief glance at his life will tell us why. Pascal was raised by a father, Etienne Pascal, who homeschooled his son with a gentle attentiveness reminiscent of Montaigne's chapter of the education of children. Himself a serious mathematician, Etienne Pascal senses that his son will be captivated by mathematics, fears that this infatuation will cause him to neglect his Latin and Greek, and therefore withholds mathematical instruction during Pascal's earliest years. So no math for you, little boy. But Pascal overhears the talk of his father and the mathematicians who come over to the house, and he begins working at it on his own. And he invents his own private geometric vocabulary of bars and rounds. He doesn't know the words lines and circles. According to his sister, the father, Etienne Pascal, discovered his son's clandestine mathematizing when he entered the 12-year-old's room one day to find the boy deriving Euclid's 32nd proposition for himself. Etienne has a change of heart and begins to instruct Blaise formally. The young man will soon make significant contributions to the history of mathematics, not only with his work on conics and the cycloid, but also with his treatise on what he calls the Arithmetic Triangle, which is known to us today as Pascal's triangle, which forms the basis of probability theory. At the age of 19, Pascal invented and presided over the manufacture of the world's first functioning calculator, which is capable of adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing numbers of as many as 6 digits. A handful of these so-called Pascaliennes survive to this day in good working order. Try that with your Texas Instruments in the year 2397. At 25, Pascal designed experiments on the void and atmospheric pressure that deflated the ancient scholastic commonplace that nature abhors a vacuum. Turns out that nature doesn't abhor a vacuum. At 33, he writes his Provincial Letters, which are daring, uproarious satires of the most powerful churchmen in France, the Jesuits, and one of the greatest bestsellers of the Ancien Regime. He then sets to work on an enormously ambitious apology for the Christian religion. Even though illness and early death will keep him from making so much as the first draft of this book, his undigested notes, collated and published by his friends as the Thoughts of Monsieur Pascal on Religion and Several Other Subjects, which were found after his death among his papers. That's the long, not very eloquent title. They have just come to be known as the Pensées, the Thoughts. This will become a classic of French moral philosophy and one of the most important works of Christian apologetics ever written. Finally, at the end of his life, he collaborated with a friend to give Paris the world's first system of public transportation called the 5-cent carriages, and he donated all the profits to charity. So Pascal's mathematical and scientific genius, his literary and philosophic brilliance, his technological and philanthropic contributions to the great Baconian project for the improvement of the human condition are the unimpeachable credentials of a first-order modern mind. But Pascal is no standard-issue modern innovator, however brilliant, for he perceives the disturbing existential consequences of the modern scientific revolution as few have before him or since. To Pascal, the universe revealed by modern physics, which again he helped create, is a world in which man finds himself at sea, prisoner of a meaningless nature that is utterly silent in the face of the human demand for the wisdom we need in order to live well. The Montaignian quest for imminent contentment, which was intended, as a later literary critic put it, Montaigne's quest was intended to vindicate nature as being complete without grace. We don't need anything more than this life here and now. Pascal thinks that takes place in the context of a universe that science relentlessly demonstrates to be no home for man. Nature is not enough, according to modern science, and Pascal's understanding. Pascal's rejoinder to Montaigne is that truly thinking scientific modernism through intensifies rather than blunts our need for transcendence. So Pascal's reflections on this existential dislocation derived as much from his moral insights as from his scientific ones. He grew up among people who fashioned their lives after the Montaignian pattern of the honnête homme, gentle, moderate, intelligent, curious sorts, who were interested in much, but carefully avoided taking anything too seriously. Pascal's examination of the lives of these adepts in the Montaignean art of pursuing our contentment imminently suggested to him that they were fooling themselves and were far more discontent than they knew. We see this in Pascal's great analysis of hunting and gambling, the latter a diversion particularly beloved by some of his friends among this class of honnêtes hommes. So he says about gambling, he says, give the gambler his winnings, asking only that he forsake his game, and you'll make him unhappy. Like if you just give me the prize without the hand of poker. That's not what I want. And yet, if you play the game without the stake, the charm of the thing is equally lost. You don't want the game without the winnings either. When we're in the game, we long for the goal at the end of it. When we possess the goal, we long for the game to begin again. In motion, we long for rest. At rest, we long for motion. So what we truly love on this analysis is diversion, that which gets our minds off of ourselves. But our love of diversion drives not only our amusements, but our most serious activities. So Pascal writes, what is it to be superintendent or chancellor or prime minister, but to have a position in which a great number of people come each morning and from every quarter, so as not to leave any of them an hour a day in which they can think about themselves. That's what's great about power and responsibility, is you have no time to face yourself. You've got too much work to do. Beyond making us feel important, responsibility is an extraordinarily effective distraction. And distraction at bottom is what we really desire. Why? Why do we want distraction? Because, as Pascal writes, we cannot sit still in our rooms. Pascal thus rediscovers the restlessness that drove Montaigne to create his art of imminent contentment. And he discovers that restlessness at work in the hearts of the greatest adepts of the Montaignean art. The love of variety so characteristic of Montaigne and his followers reveals their abiding discontent. What's the root cause of this inability to endure stillness, solitude, and quiet? Pascal tells us that it is the natural unhappiness of our weak and mortal condition, so miserable that nothing can console us when we think about it closely. We want truth, Pascal continues. We find only incertitude in ourselves. We want happiness. We find only misery and death. The truth we most assiduously hide. We want to fake everybody out into thinking that we're happy. So this unhappiness results from the distinctive human combination of finitude and intelligence. We are as weak as reeds, Pascal tells us, so fragile that we can be killed by a vapor or a drop of water. Well, this is true of every living thing. It makes man uniquely miserable because of our unique self-consciousness about the deadly facts of life. That self-consciousness makes our mortality and ignorance seem like a kind of exile or loss of place, like, as he puts it, the misery of a deposed king. That's what you feel like. You feel like a king who's been deprived of his throne. That's what all human beings feel like, what Pascal's telling. So there's a massive disproportion between the thoughts our minds seem to have been born to think and the deaths our mortal frames fate us to die. As Pascal writes, l'homme dépasse l'homme. Man transcends man. Pascal seeks to bring us to self-knowledge by making us aware of this disproportion, which he sees as the mark of both our misery and our greatness. The misery of the sole being we know of, that necessarily lives with consciousness of its own death and folly. And the greatness of the sole being we know of, that can think thoughts like universe and God. As Pascal writes, if man exalts himself, I humble him. If he humbles himself, I exalt him, until he comprehends that he's an incomprehensible monster. That's what we are, incomprehensible monsters. I think he means this term monstrous precisely. We're beings who cannot be understood in natural terms. Pascal endeavors to show us this truth about ourselves so as to set us in motion, in search of some answers to the riddle of our own beings. He hopes to make us seekers in anguish. If Pascal is right, the Montaignian quest to make ourselves imminently happy could reach a successful conclusion only at the price of the obliteration of the human heart. Our unhappiness is deeper, but our greatness is also vaster than Montaigne imagined. Our hearts are restless not accidentally, not because of moral failures such as overeagerness or inattention, but because we are wayfaring strangers, not made to be at home in this world. Pascal thus seeks to set us in motion, to make us seek, because he believes there is an answer to our questions, a hidden God, whose strange story is the weird answer to the weird question that is the human heart. But his appeal has never been limited to those who come to share his faith. Nietzsche was the first in a long line of postmodern thinkers who would exclaim, "Pascal's blood flows in my veins." For the existential unease he describes so poignantly is the quiet but insistent companion of our modern search for happiness. The self-knowledge Pascal offers is a sad wisdom. In the years after Pascal's death, Louis XIV and his age decided that it wasn't wisdom at all. Both the church and the monarchy turned against Pascal and his Jansenist friends. Pascal's works wound up on the index of prohibited books, and the Jansenist home at the monastery of Port-Royal was demolished, and its tombs were desecrated. It's worth putting a footnote here. Pope Francis has actually started the process for considering Pascal for canonization. And so, history sometimes comes full circle. As the Promethean rationalism of the Enlightenment took flight, the 18th century seemed to forget that the 17th century ever existed and simply picked up where the 16th left off, as the great French literary critic Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve put it. But once the great modern revolutions had done their work and established our liberal democracies, Alexis de Tocqueville would discover that Pascal's sad wisdom might prove profoundly relevant again.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the third and final author we consider, Alexis de Tocqueville, and this section's called Democracy and the Naked Soul. I'm going to try to police myself, I guess, with the time, since I'm also the moderator. It's kind of interesting position to be in. Okay, so we started out the story with Montaigne's insistence that we can be content with imminence. In other words, that human beings can limit their aspirations to the confines of the mortal life, that we can find our satisfaction by trying to live pleasantly and peacefully and reasonably within those confines. Pascal, as you've just heard, thought that Montaigne was brilliant, but also totally wrong about who we are and how we should live. Pascal seeks to convince us that we are both greater and more miserable than Montaigne had ever imagined, that we're beings built for anguished God-seeking rather than pleasant self-seeking. This great argument between Pascal and Montaigne deeply informed the thought of our final author, Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville was born in 1805 to an aristocratic family with deep ties to the monarchy of the pre-revolutionary period, and also to the religion, Catholicism, that seemed to be inextricably tied up with the ancient regime in France. Tocqueville's parents were, in fact, imprisoned during the revolutionary years and slated for execution in their early 20s. They were in their early 20s before they had children. They were spared only by one of the frequent changes in the revolutionary government, which allowed them to be suddenly and rather inexplicably released. But they had spent time in prison watching their friends and relatives being taken out of the cell one by one and led to the guillotine, and they never got over that experience. His father, Hervé's hair turned white at the age of 20, and his mother had a kind of nervous affliction for the rest of her days and would gather the family around the fire after dinner and sing melancholy songs about the old regime. So that's the world that Tocqueville grew up in. It would have been the easiest thing for him to kind of join his family and their friends and be a kind of counter-revolutionary. But he didn't do that. Nor did he decide to break entirely with his family's tradition and throw his lot in with the largely anti-religious partisans of freedom. Instead, he tried to chart a kind of new course. As he puts this in his most famous work, Democracy in America, he sought to see further than both parties. And he sought to do this in order to understand the possibilities and the perils of modern democratic politics, which he thought was going to dominate Western history for the foreseeable future. So a key component of Tocqueville's ability to see further than both parties was the trip he was able to take to America in the 1830s. Tocqueville was, by that point, involved in French politics. He was a member of the Chamber of Deputies. And he was sent to America by the French government with the express purpose of observing our penitentiary system, which at the time was very well functioning and even progressive. His private purpose, however, was to observe a relatively healthy democracy in order to get a better perspective on what was possible out of that political form. So he came to America with the intent of seeing something new. And he was also able, I think, to see it in a new way. For you might say he read the prose of American life with the poetry of the French moraliste resounding in his ears. He studied Pascal every day. His great friend, Gustave du Beaumont, who actually accompanied him to America, wrote that the minds of Tocqueville and Pascal were made for one another. Tocqueville's encounter with Montaigne was less intensive and largely mediated through Pascal. But when Tocqueville diagnosed the restless unhappiness of democratic man, he was essentially echoing Pascal's diagnosis of the restless unhappiness of Montaignian man. In Democracy in America, we behold the spectacle of the great drama of the soul that takes place in the pages of the moraliste, scaled down to the prosaic domestic scene of millions of ordinary households, and multiplied over the expanse of a great nation. In this country, Tocqueville sees imminent contentment become the standard of aspiration for millions of people. And it's as a reader of Pascal that he made that famous observation with which my husband began, that Americans are restless in the midst of their well-being, or restless in the midst of their prosperity, as it's sometimes translated. Tocqueville sees the existential conundrum of the thinking reed, that Pascal writes about, haunting American life. He also sees that in a democratic country, so much psychic unease cannot be without political consequences. So in the minutes remaining, I want to consider our restlessness and its political ramifications by focusing on one particular aspect of the search for imminent contentment. But I might say first that Tocqueville is somebody that is very easily excerpted, in my opinion. And if you don't teach him already in the high school classes of history, you could actually, it's a huge, Democracy in America is huge, as probably many of you know, but you can take out some chapters of it and teach that and kind of meditate on it with your students, and I think it'd be very fruitful. And I'm sure many of you do that already, but for those of you who don't, that's a thought. But the part of our search for imminent contentment that I'd like to focus on for the rest of the time here is our hostility to what Tocqueville calls forms. The hostility to forms, with all its unsettling political implications, was on full display in the Jacksonian America that Tocqueville was visiting in 1831, and they are now visible, we think, to us once again. Democratic human beings, Tocqueville writes, despise forms, which they consider as useless and inconvenient veils placed between them and the truth. While Tocqueville never defines the term forms precisely, and people argue about what he means by it, the meaning of it, we think, emerges from the portrait of aristocratic society he paints to put democracy into relief. In aristocratic society, the observation of formalities structures all of social life. You address people by their proper titles. My lady, sir, your grace, madam. One goes through the prescribed motions. You bow, you curtsy in the ballroom. You kneel and you cross yourself in church. You have to dress your part. You have to know your place in the ranks of men so as not to dishonor yourself by placing yourself too low or give offense to others by placing yourself too high. The pursuit of imminent contentment is hostile to forms from the very outset. Montaigne writes that we must tear the masks off things as well as people. And he reminds us that kings and great ladies go through the messy, funny, and sad business of bodily life just like everybody else, from toilet to boudoir to deathbed. Montaigne's frank and unpretentious irreverence is essential to his effort to scale every human pursuit down to within the circuit of imminence. We can glide lightly over the surface of life because nothing deserves to be taken with the seriousness our formalities might imply. In America, Tocqueville sees this hostility to forms democratized. To refuse to observe formalities is to take liberties, and free people enjoy taking liberties. There is nothing more discordant to our ears than being told to know our place. Formal speech, formal dress, social ranks, acts of intellectual or spiritual deference, all of them conflict with the defining belief of a democratic age, the belief in the equality of conditions. And so we strip those forms away. often engaging in a kind of ritualistic self-exposure that allows us to perform our liberation from social expectations and encumbrances. Students wear flip-flops to class. We ask other people's children to call us by our first names. We replace the organ in church by a praise band. It's all a contemporary manifestation of the nonchalance that Montaigne advocated so long ago. The hostility to forms is not merely a matter of having casual taste and having impatience for rigmarole. It has a philosophic side too, an implied metaphysical materialism. Americans, Tocqueville writes, are often disposed to, quote, believe that everything is only matter. We happen to find formality unpleasant and unnecessary in part because we suspect that form is not real. Appearance, shape, seem to us evanescent, deceptive. What's real seems to be the tangible, the material, the stuff of things, matter, things that have mass and volume. This belief has special power among us because it aligns with one of the most powerful passions of the democratic soul, what Tocqueville calls the love of material well-being. Our love of improving the material conditions of our lives, our concentration on those material conditions, makes us prone to the belief that matter is all that matters. The moral and metaphysical materialism, metaphysical materialism decisively shapes our understanding of ourselves. People who are disposed to suspect forms and trust in matter soon come to doubt the reality of the soul, which Aristotle describes as the living form of an organic being. It's the form or the soul that endures across the constant material flux of time and metabolism. It's the form that constitutes the unity and the continuity of a person. Those to whom material realities often seem like the only realities, therefore come often to doubt the reality of their very selves. I don't know about you, but my students often fall into that trap, which I find is strange. So I find them wondering that what is called the soul is as illusory and meaningless as one of those aristocratic titles people used to get so fussy about. We kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater there. As the late Peter Augustine Lawler wrote, who wrote a wonderful book on Tocqueville, democratic man comes to fear that it's his fate to be a miserable accident perceiving itself as such. To suspect that we are merely miserable accidents, of course, leaves us deeply doubtful of our own reality as rational agents whose capacities for thought and action about and on the world are real and potent. Doubt of the reality of our thinking, acting selves is the existential heart of our restlessness. Turned outward, this doubt of ourselves takes the form of a deep-seated suspicion of the motives of others. For if we have no confidence in the substantial reality of our own freedom and reason, we probably won't have confidence in the freedom and rationality of others. We'll be prone to the view that the hidden play of things like material forces and personal interests really drive everything. Our suspicion of the motives of others, ultimately rooted in our suspicion of the reality of ourselves, inclines us toward a dark, flat, and ultimately corrosive view of politics. Politics in the Aristotelian sense, which is reasoned, if perhaps intense negotiation between conflicting but plausible and earnestly held ideas about the good, seem like a mirage. Public argument, seen in the contemporary democratic light, comes to seem like a series of performative gestures that merely divert attention from the real conflicts of material interest that actually motivate everyone. When we cease to believe that people are motivated by the principles they invoke, we tend to treat them differently. So conservatives see liberals not as people earnestly, if misguidedly, working to alleviate entrenched injustice, but as insular cultural elites signaling their virtue. And conversely, liberals see conservatives not as people sincerely, if mistakenly, working to preserve traditional morality, but as rich people perpetuating their privilege. Those who invoke principles that might limit political conflict then sound weak or duplicitous. For to abide by such limits we start to fear is to be duped into observing arbitrary constraints on our latitude for action that will not be respected by our adversaries. The human beings with whom politics deals come to seem like crude masses, to be moved and manipulated by whatever means necessary. We see no particular need to handle people with delicacy or respect, or to allow them the freedom to seek a truth that cannot be seared into their brains by social pressure. In such circumstances, the whole architecture of separations, that is the hallmark invention of liberal politics, starts to seem suspect, not really purposeful, because the fundamental separation on which liberal politics rests is the separation between transcendent concerns and imminent concerns, between church and the state. This all, if we collapse, if we don't believe any longer in the transcendent and it's all imminent, our politics liberal politics in particular, comes to seem an outmoded screen for corruption. Politics in what Charles Taylor calls the imminent frame thus comes to reflect the existential restlessness of the souls that inhabit that frame. That restlessness drives political imprudence. It encourages vulgarity, rawness, and violence, and it explains our growing impatience with other human beings, who we find ever more difficult to regard as separate and serious realities that we are bound to respect. The defense of imminence, an ingenious invention of prudence that once helped mark off the space that freedom and individuality require, comes to breed a new form of imprudence, bent on collapsing all such spaces. We think the deepest source of that imprudence is our increasingly oversimplified understanding of ourselves. Here's the conclusion. We call it liberalism and the good life. If the foregoing argument is correct, a revival of the fortunes of our shaky republican government might depend on rethinking what we are and what we are living for. For the restlessness that unsettles us personally and politically ultimately stems, we think, from our continually frustrated attempt to achieve imminent contentment, which is a kind of happiness incapable of satisfying a being whose nature surpasses itself, as Pascal put it. Such a rethinking might begin with a re-examination of the early modern thinker with whom we began, Montaigne, and of the skepticism to which his case for pursuing happiness under the guise of imminent contentment is conjoined. For that skepticism has become reflexive and has unstrung our very capacity for thinking about the kind of happiness beings like us might need. Montaigne's case for moderation through variation, for a life that takes nothing as the one thing needful, depends upon his critique of all accounts, religious and philosophic, of a good life with such a center. He presents that critique in the longest chapter of the Essays. It's called the Apology for Raymond Sebond. In reading it, you start to notice that Montaigne is not making his case for skepticism by refuting in any detail the arguments that he presents for definite conceptions of the good. Rather, he draws attention to the proliferation of such conceptions, piling up the most absurd arguments next to the most reasonable ones until our heads spin. Now trust in your philosophy, he challenges the reader, and boast that you have found the bean in the cake when you consider the clatter of so many philosophic brains. This rhetorical strategy, as T.S. Eliot notes, is like an all-pervasive gas. It's more like an atmosphere we breathe in and not an argument we consider. We think that we might want to reopen that question that Montaigne raises, whether we can actually consider with reason the ways in which we might live and not succumb to the kind of rhetorical gas that he tries to make us tries to have us inhabit with the essays. Trying to cut a little bit at the end here. If we really ask the questions that Montaigne tries to get us to ignore by writing the essays, we think we might be able to reconstruct a more substantial philosophic anthropology. One that would both help our young people learn to think about what they might be able to do with their lives when they're graduating, when they're sort of baffled in the way that many of our students are when they reach the end of college. And one that might help actually help us have a more reasonable politics as we might seek together to understand the kinds of good lives that we can live in a modern democratic regime. We think that America's growing and energetic movement of classical education already embodies something of this potentially new anthropology in everything from its unapologetic use of the word virtue to its openness to the question of the divine to the relative formality of the dress code that is employed in many classical schools. We believe the growth and success of such schools that encourage the living to understand their lives with the help of the voices of the dead, might be decisive for the health of our country. And we hope our remarks may prove useful to those who are helping young people understand the prevailing culture and are helping them learn to live well within it.